What's good YouTube? Today we've got a melee tier list for Season 2 of Dragonflight. Some class buffs came in last night, which is likely to be the final tuning before we see 10.1 drop. So these are my predictions for the melee meta going into next season. So first of all, we have the Arms Warrior, which I'm going to whack straight in the A tier. Arms actually got a 4% damage buff across the board last night, so it's looking very good for this spec. So did Fury, but we'll get onto that in a second. Arms were monsters of AoE in Season 1, and it's looking to continue in Season 2. They recently changed the 4 set so that it's now Mortal Strike that's cleaving instead of your Slam, which I know a lot of Arms Warriors are going to be happy about. Mortal Strike is doing a lot of damage on PTR right now. I've seen Mortal Strike top in the meters for most Arms Warriors that I've ran with. They are unfortunately still lacking a bit of single target though. I know that was definitely a detriment that they had in Season 1, and it's looking to continue for Season 2 because the tier set isn't helping out too much with the single target. That being said though, Arms Warrior has probably one of the best AoE damage profiles in the game. Not many specs can compete with this spec. We've all seen the Arms Warriors in the first pool of Algathar Academy doing some ridiculous DPS, and it looks like that's going to continue with a lot of AoE to be had in Season 2. Unfortunately, as for the case for all Warrior specs, they don't bring amazing utility to Mythic Plus, so it takes a lot for them to be in the S tier, and that is why I've placed it in A for now. They bring you Battle Shout for if you've got a melee heavy comp, you've got Rallying Cry if you ever need to save your group, but apart from that, there's not really too much that the specs bring. They are, however, a very tanky spec. They tend to dump a lot of their rage into Ignore Pain, which is making them a lot more tanky. You have Defensive Stance for any incoming scary damage that you know is about to happen, and you also have Die by the Sword, which can be paired with Intervene to help your tank if you need to. Onto Assassination Rogue then, they also got an across the board buff by 5% last night. Their tier set does seem to be bridging the gap between inside and out their cooldowns, which is quite nice, but at the same time you kind of want to load all your damage into your cooldown windows, especially for those big packs. However, this could work nicely with Execute on those fortified weeks when you've popped your cooldowns at the start of a pack, and by the time your cooldowns actually run out, you get that damage increase, paired with your Execute window at the same time, so it could work out very nicely for the spec. Going into Season 2, it doesn't look like you're going to be Crimson Tempesting on single target anymore, but you are still going to have that strong priority damage and single target damage profile. Unfortunately, for the Assassination Rogue though, it does come up against Outlaw and Sub in the same class, so it's never going to be placed that high, or at least for next season anyway. The damage profile just isn't really a desirable one in Mythic Plus. Dots don't really tend to do too well in Mythic Plus, and when you compare it to the damage profiles of the other two specs, it's never going to be that great. That being said though, it is a rogue spec, so it brings some of the best utility in the game. It's also one of the tankiest classes in the game, so I don't think you can ever place a rogue spec too low just because of the utility they bring alone. Specific to the Assassination Rogue as well, you also have Triple Silence with your Garrotes, so that's a nice piece of unique utility that the Assassination Rogue actually brings. And so for the Assassination Rogue, I am going to put them in the B tier. The buffs they got last night were very nice, but also needed, I feel. And being a rogue spec, like I mentioned, bringing all that utility and tankiness, you really can't go wrong. Now we have the Enhancement Shaman, which was actually left untouched with the buffs and tuning last night. The tier set is looking very strong for Mythic Plus next season. It's almost like it was designed around Mythic Plus. It did get a little nerf recently, making your next 2 Chain Lightnings giga buffed instead of the 3 that it was previously, and also a little damage nerf to your physical and fire damage down to 20% from 30%. But that being said, having that burst damage tied to your sundering every 45 seconds is giga for Mythic Plus. It is slightly counterintuitive because I know in Season 1 the Enhancement Shamans were saving their sundering for AoE stops instead, so it's going to be a toss up as to whether you're going to just send this on cooldown or you might be able to wait a few seconds to pair it up with some CC at the same time, making sundering one of the most broken abilities in the game. However, the Enhancement Shaman has great damage in all scenarios. You have great single target damage, you have some of the best funnel damage in the game, spreading out those flame shocks and then nuking your prio target with your lava lashes, and it has some great sustained AoE damage as well. It is target capped for the most part, but it still definitely keeps up in AoE. With the way this spec is built at the moment as well, you're going to have damage for every single pack with your sundering. You've got your walls resetting every other second, it feels like. You've got some of the best utility for Mythic Plus in the game, in my opinion. You've obviously got your Bloodlust, which is huge, and you also have 3 different AoE stops that you can use, which is just absurd for one spec to bring that. Having your Sundering, your Cap Totem, and also your Thundershock, knocking enemies up and interrupting them. So that's huge and it has a lot of carry potential, especially in pugs. It has some great off-heal self-healing as well, though this has been nerfed a little bit going into next season, and rightly so, as we saw with the 4 DPS 1 tank comps. The only problem with the enhancement shaman is that it's a little bit squishy, but it hasn't stopped it running the highest keys in season 1, and for that reason I'm going to put this spec in the S tier. I think it's still definitely a strong contender to be in the meta for next season. It really does have everything. On to Feral Druid then, they got a 5% flat damage buff as well last night, so that is huge for this spec, especially on AoE. They are probably going to be kings of AoE. They have a pretty boring tier set and it's not that strong either, but they do have some ridiculous AoE damage that also translates into some of the best funnel damage in the game in my opinion, because you have those rips out which give you the free ferocious bites on your primary target, and then this is some of the only funnel damage in the game that actually cleaves from the funnel damage as well through your rampant ferocity. This is a really complete spec in AoE, dealing some of the best damage you can see, which I guess kind of makes up for its lacking single target unfortunately. It really struggled in season 1, and although it's getting some help going into season 2, I really can't see it being that great, so that definitely holds the Feral Druid back. They are quite a tanky spec as well, being able to drop into bear form whenever they need to if there's some big incoming damage. You've got your survival instincts, you've also got your bark skin on a short cooldown as well, so they're definitely a tanky spec, and they just did receive some healing buffs as well for their regrowth and other healing spells, not that you'll really be using those. And they also bring some decent utility as well. Being a druid, you've got the Mark of the Wild buff, which is going to be huge for your group, especially over the course of a key. You've got Vortex, Typhoon, In-Cap Roar for an AoE stop. You can chuck out off heals if you need to, and you've got some passive healing every 2 minutes from your Nature's Vigil as well. The Feral Druid is looking really strong going into next season, so I'm going to put this at the top of A tier for now. Unfortunately, it just doesn't bring that amazing single target, so I don't want to put it in S tier, but definitely a solid A. Now the Frost DK. I think this is going to be a bit of a wild card. We're going to have to see how this one performs next season, but from what I understand about the tier set and how it's working, it seems like it's going to have a very strong damage profile, especially for Mythic Plus. From what I can gather, it seems like it's going to turn Pillar of Frost into a really nice cooldown on about a 40-second cooldown if you're talented into Ice Cap. Summoning that Frostworm's Fury, which we all know how good that feels and also how much damage it does. And also you might talent into Frostwhelp's Indignation, which is going to summon some whelps as well to do some extra damage and also grant you mastery. I think that talent still does that. Let me know if I'm wrong in the comments. But that could make for some really nice burst damage on around a 40-second cooldown. Amazing for Mythic Plus, having that up for every single pack, if not 2 times a pack. I'm not sure exactly which kind of build Frost DKs are leaning in towards next season. As far as I'm aware, it's looking like 2-hand obliteration, but it definitely could be breath still. Either way, you can switch up depending on your group comp. If you've got a more coordinated group, you could go for the Breath of Sindragosa build, but 2-hand obliteration is definitely looking strong. DKs in general are a very tanky spec as well. You've got lots of self-healing, you've got AMZ, you've got AMS as well. You've got lots of defensives in your toolkit. You've got lots of unique utility. Obviously your depth grip is your main one. You've got an AoE stop in Blinding Sleep, and also you've got a battle res, which is huge for Mythic Plus. So for the DK, like I said, I'm not 100% sure on this spec, but I think I'm going to go with a high B tier for now. It definitely could end up in the A tier depending on how strong that set is. Fury Warrior, again, looking very strong for next season. Just got a 4% flat damage buff as well. Gonna whack this one straight in the A tier, just behind Feral, just because of the lack of utility in comparison to the Feral Druid, but it is looking very strong. The tier set did get nerfed recently so that you can't just spam your Bloodthirst, but it is still going to do some big damage over the course of a key. And I'm pretty sure this is going to open up your Cold Steel Hot Blood talent, which is going to give you some passive extra healing that the Fury Warrior already has copious amounts of. So that is going to help a lot with self-sustain and tankiness. As a Fury Warrior, you have insane cleave damage and also some great single target damage, which is very nice for the warrior players out there because they can swap up between the Fury and Arm specs depending on the dungeon, affixes, comp, etc. That being said though, they do bring some amazing AoE damage as well. It's just not that of the Arms Warrior. As I mentioned, they're a pretty self-reliant spec, a lot of self-healing, a lot of passive damage reductions too, but unfortunately, just like the Arms Warrior, it does lack that utility that they bring. They have the Battle Shout, like I mentioned, they have the Rallying Cry, but unless Warrior is giga busted damage-wise, it does lack that utility that will allow them to get into that S tier. Havoc Demon Hunter then, they just got buffed for their single target last night, which is definitely what they needed. In Season 1, they had amazing AoE and cleave damage, it's what they've always been known for, and it's still looking that way for Season 2, and now they just got some single target buffs as well. They were definitely one of the top melee DPS in Season 1. This is due to their crazy frequent bursts that they bring for every single pack through their Soul Rend and also their Essence Break. They bring some amazing CC as well for your comp. They've got their single target stun in Fell Eruption. They've got Sigil of Misery. They've got Chaos Nova for 2 AoE stops there. They've got Imprison, which is one of the few abilities in the game that allows you to skip mobs and stay out of combat. They are a very passively tanky spec as well. Lots of passive damage reduction. They've got Blur on a short cooldown, Nether Walk if they want to talent into an immunity or a pseudo immunity, and you can bring Darkness for your group as well. Not the best defensive cooldown in the game, but definitely underrated. And of course, being a Demon Hunter, they bring Chaos Brand for your caster comps, which is going to be huge and add up a lot of damage over the course of a key. I think just because of how the Havoc Demon Hunter is built and how its kit is built for Mythic Plus, basically, it would struggle to ever not be in the A tier, and I'm definitely going to put this one in the top of A tier for now. It could potentially slip into the S tier. We'll have to see how the tier set actually performs. It's not looking like the greatest tier set in the world for the Havoc Demon Hunter, but regardless, even without the tier set, they are a very strong pick, especially for dungeon content. Another spec that is always a very strong contender for Mythic Plus is the Outlaw Rogue. Last night, they just got buffs to their finisher abilities, and this is going to translate directly into AoE as well. Their tier set does look pretty strong as well for next season, so they've got that going for them. Outlaw's always a top performer in Mythic Plus. They have an amazing damage profile in that it's pure single target and prio damage that translates directly into AoE damage, and it does a hell of a lot of it as well. They also have CDR on all of their abilities through their Restless Blades passive, which is amazing for Mythic Plus because it means your cooldowns are always getting reduced and therefore up for every single pack, if not multiple times a pack depending on the length of it. So that helps their overall damage over the course of a key. Being a rogue, they have some of the best utility in the game. You've got your cheap shots, you've got your kidney shots, blind, sap, one of those abilities that you can skip mobs with. You've got your gouge as well. You've got shroud as well, which is unique to the rogue and would carry it alone from a utility perspective. It just opens up the dungeon so much more for your team, allows you to get optimal pathing, get Bloodlust on cooldown exactly where you want to get it on cooldown. It is seriously some of the best utility in the game. And being a rogue, you're pretty much unkillable as well. You've got evasion, you've got Cloak of Shadows, you've got feint, cheat death, some of the strongest cooldowns in the game for all rogue specs. For the Outlaw Rogue, I'm going to whack it at the top of A tier. It probably could be interchangeable with the Havoc Demon Hunter, but there is a reason that I'm putting that here, and I will go over that later. On to the talk of the town at the moment then, it is going to be the Retribution Paladin. If you're enjoying the video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Ret Paladin is looking insanely strong going into Season 2. Their tier set is going to buff their cleave damage, especially during their wings windows, and also give them that little bit of extra single target that they definitely need. They have a 1 minute very bursty damage profile, especially in AoE, which is amazing for Mythic Plus. You really cannot ask for a better damage profile. All of their cooldowns are pulled into that 1 minute window. You will really have a hard time competing with a Ret Paladin, especially in AoE. They could deal with a little bit more single target, however you can drop some talents here and there, pick up some other ones and compensate for that to get an extra little bit of single target. They bring some of the best utility in the game, and with prop paladins just getting nerfed last night, we probably aren't going to see as many of those, so there's not going to be as much overlap, but you'll bring in your new Retribution aura, which is going to increase your group's damage by a hell of a lot over the course of a key whenever they're taking big damage, which is all the time in Mythic Plus. You've got all your different blessings for niche scenarios that is going to appear quite frequently in Mythic Plus as well. You've got an AoE stop with Blinding Light, you've got a single target stop with Hammer of Justice, great off heals as well if you need to for the cost of damage. They're insanely tanky, they really have a plethora of defensive cooldowns. This rework has done wonders for the spec, and it's no wonder that so many people are talking about them at the moment. They now also bring a battle res, new coming into Dragonflight, but it's been around for obviously a while now. And most importantly, I think the community perception has changed massively for the spec. Before, you would never invite a pink class to your key. Now, if you see a Ret Paladin sign up for your key, instant invite, don't care about their score, don't care about their gear, they're still going to top the damage, it does not matter. Absolute S tier for this Giga Chad of a spec. Staying on the topic of Giga Chad specs then, we've got the Sub Rogue. I feel like Rogue's always got to have one S tier spec for Mythic Plus at this point. Last night they just got a buff to their single target through their Eviscerate and Shadow Strike damage, and Sub in my opinion is looking like the king of the Rogue specs for next season. I'm not too familiar with the specifics of how Sub Rogue works in Dragonflight. However, with the tier set going into next season, it's looking like they're going to get a lot more Symbols of Death uptime, potentially even perma uptime, which I was questioning myself about. That's what I was saying when I don't know too much about the spec. And you're also getting buffs to your finishes through your tier set from your crit damage, which Sub Rogue really likes to stack as well, and that's going to scale very nicely with the extra stats we're going to get into next season. Sub has giga mass AoE. They do some amazing AoE damage. They have some of the best funnel damage in the game if you really need to take out a dangerous mob. However, you do lose your AoE for it, so it's not the best funnel in the game, I wouldn't say, but depending on the scenario, it definitely can be. If you need to absolutely nuke a mob down, Sub is going to pour those eviscerates into him and take him out. And this is actually really underrated as well, because it could potentially speed up the overall time of the key instead of nuking down the whole pack and then just being left with one mob that you have to take down by itself. Sub also has arguably some of the best stops out of all the rogue specs, being able to spam those cheap shots. You will lose some damage for this, obviously, because you're spending your globals on cheap shot instead and a little bit of energy, but if you need those multiple stops, then Sub is your go-to. I'm not going to go over the insane amounts of utility and defensives that the Sub Rogue brings. I've been over that with the Outlaw and Assassination Rogue, but all you need to know is Sub is the top of S tier. I think the utility does carry it to the top of S tier. It probably wouldn't be the top if it didn't bring what it brought. However, it is looking very strong for next season, and it's no surprise that we have a rogue spec on top again. Onto the Survival Hunter then, which is a bit of a hot topic. The tier set keeps getting nerfed for this. They were looking very strong for next season. I'm not so sure anymore because their tier set does keep receiving nerfs for some unknown reason. They were slept on in season 1. People do give Survival Hunter a really bad rap, but whenever you invite one to the key, people are always surprised about how much damage they can actually deal, and a lot of it is prio damage as well, which is very important for those higher keys. Going into season 2, they are still bringing that great priority and single target damage. It's unfortunately not going to be as good as season 1 just because they are losing that tier set, but their AoE is getting a massive buff going into season 2, being able to spam out those wildfire bombs through all the CDR that you get from your tier set and also the new talents like Lunge. They have amazing cleave damage as well, especially in their cooldown window, firing out those kill shots at 4 targets. You really cannot compete. Unique to a few specs as well, the Survival Hunter has access to the new very rare polearm going into next season. We all saw how the Razageth bow affected the BM Hunters in season 1, so who knows how this is going to end up for survival in season 2. We'll have to see, but it's going to help out with the AoE as well. Hunters do bring some unique utility like your binding shot. You've got your single target stun through intimidation as well. You can bring lust at the cost of a defensive. Blizzard, please sort that out for hunters. Our lust should not be tied to a pet. And ironically, the Survival Hunter is not that tanky of a spec. They are able to stat more into verse and not lose as much damage for it. However, that's not going to help them too much. They got some buffs from the rejuvenating winds buff as well to their max health, but in comparison to the other melee specs, they are definitely lacking in that department. Before the constant nerfs to the tier set, I probably would have had this spec maybe even in the bottom of A tier, but probably top of B. But after the nerfs, it's probably taken quite a toll, so I'm going to put this one in the bottom of B for now. It's definitely still a viable spec, so survival's in the bottom of B for now. Onto Unholy DK then. It's definitely taken a bit of a turn with the DK specs, so I do think Frost is better than Unholy at the moment going into next season. It seems like they can't figure out what to do with the Unholy set. They have buffed it, so it is that bit better, but it's still going to struggle. In a coordinated group, you probably still could get away with pumping out a lot of damage on the Unholy DK, especially in an AoE setting. And they also have the nice benefit of being able to spec into a more single target focused build. They are, however, going to lose some huge burst potential from losing the puzzle box from season 1. This was some huge mastery on demand for this spec when they needed it in their cooldown windows. That being said though, they are going to counter this with getting some extra mastery from their tier set. They changed it so the army is now going to grant 20 stacks of your Master of Death as well, so that is very nice for some on-demand burst. They're still going to have some very good AoE. I just think Frost is going to be better overall, and especially when you're not in a coordinated group. But people do always sleep on the DK in general, I think. They are a very tanky spec. They have a lot of defensives to use. They have some really unique utility as well that's going to help out your group a lot of stops as well to counter mobs. But for the Unholy DK, I don't think it's going to be too much of a difference, but I am going to put the Unholy just behind the Frost DK. I do think Frost is going to be the play for next season at this current state. And finally, we have the Windwalker Monk. Honestly, I haven't really seen any Windwalker Monks on the PTR so far. I don't know if that speaks for itself, but Windwalker generally doesn't scale amazingly with secondary stats. We've always known this. Its tier set is going to help with some AoE damage, although they already were quite good at AoE. They definitely struggle on the single target aspect though. They are going to get some extra prio damage from the 4 set, so that is going to help with this, though I do think they are still struggling going into next season. Windwalker's always had a great toolkit for Mythic Plus though, from their utility and tankiness perspective. They have a lot of defensives that they can use and also have some very unique utility that they can bring to the group. They have the Mystic Touch, which is going to be huge for a melee heavy comp. They have Ring of Peace to help out your tank, an AoE stun in leg sweep and also paralysis, so they definitely don't lack in the utility department. And I think that honestly carries them because damage wise they're not looking amazing for next season, so I'm going to put the Windwalker Monk in the top of B tier. So as you can see, it's looking quite promising for the melee specs next season. We'll have to see how they deal with the actual mechanics inside the dungeons. But from a power standpoint, they are all looking to be in a very strong place. The only questions I'm asking myself is you could probably argue that survival and assassination are in the C tier, but I think they do their job. I also think they're always pretty slept on. People are quite pleasantly surprised when they invite these specs to their key and they deal a lot of damage. And most importantly, all of these specs are going to be viable for most keys you're doing. They can all definitely complete a weekly 20, so don't be hesitant to invite your survival hunters and assassination rogues. They will still carry their weight. Let me know down in the comments if you guys agree with this tier list on the strength of melee going into next season, and also what you think of my placement on your spec. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like down below and also subscribe to your boy. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.